I'll tell you about a recurring dream I had in my 20s. It lasted for about 6 months. Every night I'd return to the same place and meet the same people, and there was nothing I could do about it. The setting was a passenger terminal at an airport. Keep in mind, I'm not big on air travel. It was bad enough before. You had to remove your socks and shoes and belt and get irradiated by a full-body scanner. Now, well, we all know what it's like now. You have to put your life on the line for some fun in the sun. However, the airport of my dreams was from a different time. Not too long ago, but enough to make a difference. It was a rather generic building, a touch brutalist as architecture goes, but nothing too eye-catching. The departures board remained permanently delayed. Now and again the bong of a tannoy would interrupt the relative silence, but there was never any announcements. The ceilings were impossibly high, and it was always daytime. There were barely any staff on duty, and no more than a few dozen passengers milling around the terminal. On my first night in the airport, I kept mainly to myself. I sat down on a padded bench and watched the passengers wheel their luggage around the concourse. Eventually, I followed them and wandered by the empty ticket booths, abandoned restaurants and retail units, and found myself in a small convenience store. It was filled with magazines and books. I tried to read a few, but the words kept jumping before my eyes. In my youth, I've had many recurring dreams, and some extremely lucid episodes. But it wasn't until my 20s that I attempted to read text. During one particularly memorable experience, I was presented with a large red leather book. The cover was embossed in ornate gold leaf. I attempted to read the title and author, carefully deciphering each letter, but the text slowly transformed into golden human figures, dancing and contorting into different shapes, leaving the print garbled. It puzzles me that I can read signs in dreams, but barely more than a few words at a time. Perhaps it's something to do with a primeval mind, an innate preference for symbolism and iconography. As time went by and the recurring dream persisted, I became despondent. I took to sleeping on my favourite bench and dreamt of being somewhere else. The dreams within dreams were a nice distraction, but they did nothing to end my nightly visits to the airport. I made mental notes, examining my surroundings in more detail. All the doors appeared to be locked, and the few windows available let in a hazy bright white light. Like nearly every window in my dreams, the glass was frosted and impossible to see through. I never think to break them at the time, as if I know that once I do, there's no turning back. An instinct tells me that the white and hazy light that lines the perimeter of so many of my dreams could be the threshold between life and death. Over the weeks, I started conversations with those around me. Most appeared to remain in a permanent state of shock, as if they hadn't spoke a word in years. But with some effort, I worked the room and talked with those who would respond. I struck up conversations with a security guard, a toilet attendant, a solitary clerk behind a check-in desk, and many would-be passengers with varying degrees of success. The security guard was the first to confess he was confused and that nothing about the airport made sense. There were no flights, no baggage controllers. Most of the stores were closed, same with the check-in desks. The other security guards had gone AWOL, not that he could remember any names, not even his own. But the cancelled flights, the lack of passengers, that had him worried that the airport might close down. I asked him what the airport was called. He didn't know and laughed. I pushed a little harder and asked him why all the doors were locked. The guard became defensive and told me he was only doing his job. Above the only working check-in hung a large enamel logo of a white ring and a blue arrow. Beneath it stood the one booking clerk in the whole place, working a never-ending shift. She looked frustrated and angry, constantly dealing with passenger complaints. Sometimes I'd intervene and ask the crowd to be patient, which more often than not would work for a while. Sure enough, some of the passengers began to ask me questions, and after a few heated arguments, I realised that everyone but myself had died long ago. The passengers, the staff, their vague memories and identities, all fixated on the past and looking for a way out. The airport was in limbo, the border town between dreams and death. It's a common complaint amongst the recently dead to feel somewhat disorientated. The airport provides a familiar environment, a safe place to readjust and decide what to do next. Except none of those at the airport seem to believe that they've been there more than a few hours. The promise of flights to exotic destinations or a chance to fly home was a welcome distraction from the painful truth. Each night, I did what I could to make the people around me feel comfortable. I listened to life stories, strange theories and regrets. A sanitation worker who had lost an arm in a war. An old lady with far too much baggage who felt utterly alone since her hubby died. She fretted about her pet cat, which was flying cargo and was worried it might freeze. But no matter who I talked with, few ever talked to each other. They could tell I wasn't one of them. I came and went freely, whilst they remained waiting. After months of dreaming of the airport, the terminus of life, there was a distinct change in atmosphere, a tension in the air. Everybody was playing up, jumping up and down on benches, throwing magazines on the ground, singing and shouting, kicking over bins and potted plants. I wanted out of the airport for so long, and I was not alone in my frustrations. A crowd unexpectedly surged and heaved at the two great wide doors of the main gate. The bolts creaked and the chains rattled. Something began to give, and an awful groaning sound drew the attention of yet more passengers. They rushed in, kicking and thumping, heaving the doors to and fro. Eventually, together, they caused such a ruckus that the security guard backed down and unlocked every door in the airport. I watched in disbelief as a dozen passengers dashed out onto what should have been an airport runway, but it was so bright I couldn't see a thing. The light was overpowering. I took one step outside and tried to follow them, but immediately woke in my bed, never to dream of the airport again. I've had other recurring dreams. I used to sleepwalk as a child, so did my sister. But the airport will always haunt me. The place and the people felt so real, and I'd been there for so long. It deeply affected me, and ever since, I've never quite been able to shake the feeling that waking life is a shared dream, and at least for me, not quite so convincing anymore.